Good evening, everyone. Come on in, get seated. Come up front. There are lots of seats up front. And if you sit up front, you can be filmed because we are videotaping this event tonight. And then we can find you better when you have questions later in the program. So I'm Julie McClintock. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to a place to call home, making housing available for all income levels. Tonight, one of our purposes in doing this program, which is hosted by Chapel Hill Alliance for a Livable Town, is to broaden the definition of what we often call, quote unquote, affordable housing. So a couple housekeeping items. Please mute your cell phones. And hold your applause after each speaker so that we can be sure to have plenty of time for discussion. Basically, the overview of the agenda you have right in front of you. Nancy Oates, as member of the Chapel Town Council, is going to frame the issues, and then we've got three very interesting speakers who will address the complexity of this topic. And then at the end, Sheila Kreth will lead us in a discussion and kind of figure out where we go next. I think that's it. So I'm going to now introduce Nancy Oates, member of the Chapel Hill Town Council. She is a longtime advocate for affordable housing. She started the Chapel Hill Watch blog in 2009, and she was elected to the Town Council in 2015. Nancy.
Oh, I am? No.
I'm not Nancy Oates. Okay.
Thank you.
My MIT education allowed me to do that.
A lot of you have heard me advocate for affordable housing for years. I don't know that I've ever articulated why affordable housing matters to me. I'm an introvert, and I understand how important it is to have a place to go to recharge, someplace that is safe and clean and warm and an escape from the world where you can go and just rejuvenate. And that's beyond the economics, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about tonight. I take Town Council's goal of a place for everyone seriously. From an economic development perspective, we want to attract residents with significant discretionary income and spending money who will be the customers of our upscale restaurants and stores. That sales tax revenue benefits all of us. And we've done a good job of creating housing for the financially secure and the upwardly mobile. But we have not done as good a job for those who hold the modestly paid jobs that support the lifestyle so many of us enjoy. We have few housing options for those who work in restaurants and stores or in many of the hospital jobs or on campus or who keep our town safe and clean and functioning well. Only 10% of town employees live in Chapel Hill. Addressing the affordable housing problem requires us to offer housing options for people along a broad spectrum. We have an inclusionary zoning ordinance in Chapel Hill, and those are the details. And it's important to understand that it is very specific. We sometimes use the term loosely. But studies show that people of a mix of income levels living together is the healthiest environment for a community. And of the 5 projects eligible for inclusionary zoning since the ordinance was passed in June of 2010, only one has met the ordinance fully, and that was through a payment in lieu, not with actual units. And the reason that even though we have an ordinance and not everybody meets it is because when a developer applies for an SUP or a development agreement, council can make exceptions to the ordinances, to the LUMO ordinances. And if the presented alternative seems to be equivalent to the ordinance, we as a council can change it. But we haven't backed inclusionary zoning as frequently as I would like. We've had some compromises. One project had its affordable units at 100% of the AMI, and another had affordable units at half of them at 100% and half of them at 80% of the AMI. And as I said, the one project that did meet it fully did it with a payment in lieu instead of units. All right, so these are the income limits of 80% and 65% levels of AMI. Housing is considered affordable if it costs no more than 30% of a household's gross income, and that includes utilities. So for for housing to be considered affordable, it has to be 30% of affordable to 30% of somebody making that income, and that includes the utilities, as I said. So someone making $47,000 a year brings home after taxes about $2,750 a month. So 30% of of that gross for housing and utilities would be about $1,175 a month. That leaves the person with $1,500 a month for groceries, phone service, insurance, car, gas, maintenance, clothing, all of those other things that we spend our money on. And there are a few places in Chapel Hill where a mortgage or rent plus utilities is no more than $1,175. So, who are these people at the 80 and 65% level? This shows us that town employees, teachers, hospital workers all make about that amount. These are all people that we need to keep our community functioning. Builders will tell us that the current lending environment precludes them from meeting our inclusionary zoning ordinance. And if that's the case, then we need to tweak the ordinance so that it can be applied across the board and it's not renegotiated with every project. We need to think of affordable housing as something as something more than just we tend to think of affordable housing as something that has to be subsidized by taxpayers, and in many cases that is true. But we sometimes see ourselves as the beneficiaries, as the benefactors, helping those who are less fortunate than us. And I'd like to see us change that mindset to see people who need affordable housing as valued members of our community. And I'd like to encourage us to take a broader view to make room for housing options that are not subsidized by taxpayers. At one committee meeting that I was at, I mentioned the possibility of the town planning department smoothing the way, making it easier for tract builders. And I heard the sharp intake of breath of somebody else on council who perhaps thought that maybe cookie cutter subdivisions were not what we wanted in Chapel Hill in the middle of all our custom homes. But a survey of town workers showed that many of them preferred the single-family detached houses, not apartments, and a cookie-cutter neighborhood would be a way to reduce the housing costs to a target market for which there's a significant demand. And as we look for solutions, I would urge us to be cognizant of the modestly paid people who keep our businesses functioning, who have to move ever farther out of town to afford housing. And with the ever-increasing wealth gap in our country and in Chapel Hill, there will be more and more people who work in town, but who won't be able to afford to live near their jobs. And with that, I'll turn it over to the experts who can tell you how to make this happen.
Okay, go ahead. Do you want to make an adjustment?
We're going to flip to the next slide.
Good. While Ken's making that adjustment, let me introduce our next speaker. Tim Jesisek is Vice President of Real Estate Development for Grubb Properties. He went to graduate school at UNC and lives in Chapel Hill. His specific and sole responsibility at Grubb Properties is Glen Lennox. So we're turning this part of the program to look at private and nonprofit initiatives that have worked.
All right, good evening. Thank you for inviting me here. Again, my name is Tim Jesisek with Grubb Properties, and while the Charlotte office is our headquarters, I work out of the Cary office, and I live in Chapel Hill. I went to grad school here, and I know Glen Lennox quite well. And tonight, I just kind of want to give everyone a little background about how Grubb approaches affordable housing and what works in Glen Lennox. On the off chance you live in this community and don't know where we are, we're at 15501 and 54. There's bin 54 in Jujubee. And some people might forget, we've got 70 acres behind us. So we have a different opportunity than a lot of other developers, which affords us different options. So just kind of a preview here. I want to just quickly review the Glen Lennox Development Agreement, which helped guide what we're doing and what we're able to do, some of the challenges, I know that will come in more later, and Grubb's approach. So you may or may not know, it took 7 years of collaboration with the town and community to come together with this 200-page riveting read that you can get on the town website. Now, you laugh, this is not just a prop either. I carry this with me wherever I go. I spend weekends in the hammock reviewing it. I have to know this. Not every weekend, I have a little bit of a life. But what it was a combination of town goals and Grubb goals, and you'll see a lot of things in here. How do we incent affordable housing while encouraging economic development at the same time? And we all know this, but at the end of the day, no matter what my presentation says, it comes down to it's really hard, and there's no one answer. And we have some approaches that work, but we can't do it all, and it doesn't work for everyone. But all these pieces together can move the needle significantly. So again, for the development agreement, again, you can find this online. We have kind of this concept plan the community and town came up with. And there are things that you may or may not notice. Along here, the blue is office, and this part is multifamily, and then there's retail and preserved housing. But one of the keys you may or may not notice is there's almost always office and multifamily paired together, and that's deliberate. We share a lot of costs. It is incredibly hard to lower costs. So when you hear developers talking about how hard it is, they're generally not lying. It is brutal. Costs are going up constantly. So we try to do shared parking, and if we take away one piece, we can't do the other one. So the affordable housing can help come in with our Link apartment brand, while the office can incent economic development. And we're working on our first phase in that top left corner right now. The challenges, and you've seen these before, but man, it takes a long time to build. To get your permit, to build, it can be years and years and years. And construction costs, you've heard this, are often rising at 5 to 15% annually. It is crazy. Whatever model we build in Excel cannot begin to account for the, in fact, we just have one of our projects that got priced by a general contractor in Winston-Salem. Same contractors doing our first Link project in Glen Lennox. They've told us costs across the board are 10 to 15% higher. So we are scrambling on Wednesday to go through with the red pen and cut, whatever we can do, just so we can afford this. There are options, but it's hard. And most developers, believe it or not, don't all have yachts. We have a limited supply of cash. So we have to get outside investors. We have to get loans. We have to get equity partners. And to cover all those costs that keep going up and give them the returns they demand, people tend to build the nicer housing, which we get some more supply, but it doesn't always address the affordability issues we want. So that's a hard part. And investors often have just a 5-year time frame. They'll say, sure, $10 million, absolutely, but we need a return in 5 years. And if you're a developer, ouch, how do you get that? It can take 10 years sometimes to get a property up there. And these last two are interesting. Sheila and I talked a little bit about this. Building more units doesn't automatically lower prices. That's hard. There's a ton of demand, the largest since the baby boom generation. So we have to build more and more than you can even imagine just to keep up. And when I was in grad school, Alta Springs was the cool place to live. That was the nice end. And now the ones that are being built are above it. So Alta Springs was like $700 for a 1-bedroom, and then the new ones are $1,000. And when rents go up, they go up together. They don't always sync. Now, so the low ones will slow. There's a cap, but that's only part of the way to help. We have to build a ton more housing just to get the demand. And then small changes in rents can have a huge impact on value. Boring finance stuff sometimes, but you'll hear a lot, well, why can't we just lower rents by like $50 a month? Well, $50 a month at Glen Lennox with 440 apartments would get us to $264,000 a year less. Great. And then when an investor comes in, they use what are called cap rates. It's a standard term. They're like, this is the measure of risk. And so you divide $264,000 by this 6%. And the end lesson is the entire value of your apartment community is lowered by about $4 million. It'd be like someone came into your home and said, I just need to take $100,000 off the value. You're like, it can be hard, but we have ways to do it. We try. And Grubb's approach is link apartments, and this has worked for us because we think the affordability crisis is huge. It's the largest demand since the baby boom generation. We can hardly keep up, and CHALT knows this more than most. 80% of Americans can't afford to buy a single-family home based on average prices. 40% can't afford to rent. That is heartbreaking. That's a lot of impact for our entire economic outlook. This is slightly better. So Link Apartments has about 50 strategies we use and that work for us because we're long-term holders, which means we don't have to always sell our apartment community immediately. Some developers don't have that cash. The way they fund more housing is by selling it so they can build more. We try to hold it as long as we can. So the Glen Lennox has a fund. People say, oh, you raised $50 million. A single apartment project, ours, costs around 60. We're not even close to coming through like 12 of these. So what we do is we take 6 kind of similar units and we try to remix them so it's standard. And this helps us target what Nancy was referring to a little bit as workforce housing. It doesn't mean if you're below that, you're not working. It's just a federal term, and that means if you're making between 80 to 120% of the median income. And in the US in 2016, that was 59,000, which gives us a range of $47,000 to about $70,000 of annual income. And our target range then across the country would be about $1,300 to $1,945 a month. But our apartments are really focused on millennials and teachers. As a former teacher, let me tell you, I really enjoyed that $26,500 a year. I could rent nothing. It's fun to have a roommate when you're 30. It gets old really fast. So I don't want to live 30 miles out in falling down apartments. So this is how we're trying to approach it, by taking 50 different approaches, including that shared parking, and we've got a bunch of other ones. Entitlement speeding up. Sometimes communities and towns will help us with, say, parking. In Winston-Salem, there's a parking share with the town. So we can get some revenue and they can get parking. We do every little thing we can to cut costs. We're doing HUD financing right now. It's delayed us by a year. It's a lot of brain damage to get that done, but it gives us a lower rate. So we can lower rents by even $10 a month. And that will add up and help us get investors who will actually join us and help us build these things. What else do we have? Yeah, financing strategies, anything we can do, cost subsidies. We have all kinds of tiny, like 50 different things we are trying to do, and they don't always work, but we try to do everything we can. And our real target here is kind of millennials. And you'll see that most of millennials make about $44,000 a year, 70%, 40,000 or less. So similar to what Nancy was talking about, that means for a third, we're targeting an $1,100 rent for a really great apartment that you're proud of, that you want to stay in. And that's really hard when costs keep going up 15% a month. So we are value, what we call affordable luxury. We're not going to build the nicest, the biggest. We are trying to build, I like to use the analogy of an Acura. We're not a high-end Mercedes. We're a really nice Honda, and you're proud to drive that, and it will last, and you'll enjoy living there. And more specifically, we also try to target millennial women residents, because as many of you know, there's a gender pay gap, and wage growth is slower. So all of our apartments are apartments while anyone can live there. If you walk through, you'll pick up usually a more feminine design flair because it's targeted. And Rachel Russell, the woman who had the role before me, was the one who said, there will be bathtubs. We want bathtubs. I know you guys want showers, bathtubs. So you'll see some of these things, but we found any age residents there, families live there, but this is how we approach it, just trying to shrink our unit size, use the same 6 apartment designs over and over, so our general contractors have the same cost, and they know what they're building. We met with our general contractor and we said, we'll use you over and over because hopefully you will get smarter. We will get smarter together and we will cut costs. So this is what we're doing. And this can work for some developers, but not all. You have to trust that partner. And we've worked with general contractors that haven't worked out. So like similar with our architects, we're trying to use the same architect team. So we're not reinventing the wheel every time. They say, we know your Link product. So this is how we approach it, and that's one approach other developers can use. One thing you might have heard about in Glen Lennox, which is in the development agreement, is the vested renter program. Now, Nancy talked about the inclusionary zoning ordinance, which is often for sale, 15%, meeting some of those. This is our renter program. So if you are in Glen Lennox for at least 5 years, whatever your rent is ending at that 5 years, we kind of freeze it there, and then your rent growth is capped at CPI, Consumer Price Index, with a ceiling of 5% and a floor of 2%. So the potential rent growth is limited. And if you've watched rent in the last several years, you know that sometimes rents go up 10% a year. I still rent. Let me tell you how much fun that's been. My Finley Forest renting apartment and Alta apartments are no longer what they used to be. They're almost double. So we freeze it this way, and then given that we have a large redevelopment and demolition is going to happen, if a resident has to move out, they can move into any older original existing apartment or a new one. So the 2-bedroom apartments at Glen Lennox, you can imagine, built in 1953 with 0 insulation. They're beautiful, they're charming, the utility bills are disturbing. So your total cost is higher. You say, oh, look, my rent is cheaper, but why are my utility bills $300? That doesn't help anybody. So these people have a 2-bedroom, let's say that's $800, I don't actually know what it is at Glen Lennox. They can go to a 2-bedroom in the brand new affordable luxury Link apartments for the same price. So that's how we are trying to tackle some of these things. And Grub likes this specifically because we find a value in the community stability. There are not a ton of people who are hanging out in apartments for 5 years, but we have enough. We have people who've been there for sometimes 25 and 30 years, which is kind of neat. And we have a lot of older residents who are on fixed incomes and legitimately scared about what's going to happen when my rents keep going up. But when we have community meetings, it's kind of fun to see. So Vanessa is our property manager, and so say, oh, he never comes out. He's the 85-year-old guy. And he's like, wait, can I have hardwoods? Wait a minute, I actually going to have laundry in my apartment? I'm moving, which is kind of exciting. So you see some people excited about moving because they can still be in there. And beyond Glen Lennox, just recently, Grub instituted this policy portfolio-wide. So we don't have only Link, we have other kinds of apartments, but any Grub apartment anywhere, if you've been there for at least 5 years in good standing, you can have your rent locked in. Because we like to have that community stability where people can say, oh, I've been here for a while, which is kind of neat. And there are people who are, again, their apartments have been there since the late 60s in Glen Lennox, and apparently some of the apartments look exactly the same. So if you're looking for a time capsule, go check those out. They will not let us change them or upgrade them. But this is just one of the ways, and something like this works for rental, it works for us, we value it. It could be an interesting town policy. It might not work for every developer. I'd like to hear, but this limits it, because they're not going to have 300 people in a college town who are renting for 5 years. They tend to move, but some people who do stay, it gives them an opportunity if they can't buy or don't want to buy, because not everyone has that cash for the down payment. So again, at the end, there's no single solution. We don't have all the answers, we don't pretend to, but this is incredibly important to us because we think it does impact the community and the larger country. We can't do it alone. But what I like to see is that there are so many groups in Chapel Hill doing this. I met with Camille Berry at the Community Home Trust. They're doing great work. Habitat has a role to play. The town has helped us with our development agreement, even our site plan, letting us pair some of these things. Grants, CHALT is obviously here. So I think all of us doing small different things are going to just come at this problem from so many ways we can make an actual impact. Because I like what we're doing, but it's not enough to solve it. But all of this is one way. Whatever that way is going to look in the end is to be determined. But we've got a lot of interesting options in a town that genuinely cares, which is good. Thank you so much.
So much, Tim, and I'm sure your talk is going to elicit a lot of questions, right, in a little bit. So next on the agenda is another successful venture. Hudson Vaughn is co-founder and senior director of the Marion Cheek Jackson Center. Thank you. One of the primary partners in the Northside Neighborhood Initiative. He is member of the Orange County Affordable Housing Coalition and a leader in recent affordable housing advocacy efforts in the towns and county. So Hudson?
Good evening. I'm going to stick behind the podium and try to stick a little bit to my paper. Otherwise, as Ed out there will know, 15 minutes can pass in no time for me. So I'm going to try to stick to the script a little bit. And normally I do a lot more about the history of the Northside Neighborhood Initiative and the history of Northside and how this initiative arose. Because of the time, I'm going to kind of go right to mostly how it's working. But if you have questions about that, I'd love to address those as we get there. And so I have the privilege to speak on behalf of the Northside Neighborhood Initiative and have been blessed to be a part of this initiative that's been led by hundreds of neighbors and dozens of partners. I have a map here just to show you. Most of you, I think, probably know and are familiar with Northside, but just its relationship to UNC and downtown. And I have one historic slide just to show that Northside is the largest historically Black neighborhood in Chapel Hill. It was founded as a service community to UNC. Neighbors have led the struggle for freedom, built the university, and sustained this town for generations. Many neighbors are fourth and fifth generation in the neighborhood. Ms. Velma on that last slide has lived in her same home for 96 years. And so this is one of the most, if not the most historic neighborhood in Chapel Hill. And it has been a priority, thankfully, within the town of Chapel Hill over the last several years. And it is today still one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the county. And so in the early 2000s, investors began to speculate on properties in Northside, seeing that they could buy homes near UNC for less than other parts of town and convert them into student stuffers, 4 to 8 bedroom student rental properties, charging upwards of $3,000, $4,000 a month. And so these are investor-owned student rentals in 2000. Many folks who were at council 5 years ago would have seen these. 2005, 2011. And so you see the pace of that investment growing rapidly. Speculators from all over the United States started to see this as an investment opportunity. And so neighbors came together, a coalition of hundreds of neighbors and dozens of organizations, Empowerment, the NAACP, a coalition called the Sustaining Ourselves Coalition, and came here to council to lobby for a historic moratorium and a series of defensive measures to try to stop the flow of those investor-owned properties. It's hard to see this, but just to show the rise of property taxes for historic neighbors during that same period of time, so you can see that chart, and then some of the homes that were being built onto the backs of historic homes in the neighborhood right as folks would pass away. And so there was a lot of speculation, some that was honest and some that really wasn't. And so we had a group of neighbors come together. And during that time, so we put these defensive mechanisms into place. But in 2012, in partnership with Self-Help, we started a new community planning effort and a Northside Compass group. And so this was a group that was trying to work specifically on housing strategies to say, okay, here's where we are now. Here's where our market is, and here's what our aspirations are. Now, what can we really do to bend this market towards justice? Because right now, the flow is in one direction only. There's a flow out of African Americans and historic families, and there's a flow in of 18 to 22-year-old students. And so if we're gonna have a balanced and diverse neighborhood at all, there has to be a market intervention that's more than defensive. It has to turn defense to offense. And so there was a whole series of community meetings, and those led to a set of 4 strategies, which I could talk more about, but the primary one was retention. How do we keep neighbors in their homes who want to stay in their homes? And then how do we create new opportunities for families who would want to take part in Northside's legacy? And so, but in the midst of all of that, neighbors were saying, okay, we're mobilizing our networks. We can beat investors to the information, but we still have the problem that every time investors have the quick cash, they can beat us to properties. So what can we do to intervene in this housing market? And so you have this quote from one who says, you know, we can find these families, but we're still not winning. We're still not able to get to those houses. And so we started a series of partnerships. So this just shows a few of the key partners that have participated in the Northside Neighborhood Initiative, from our housing partners like the Community Home Trust, Empowerment, and Habitat for Humanity, to some of the funding partners. But one of the big things was that we were able to use those implementation strategies to really try to find some funding partners to say, we've got to actually have an acquisition fund and matching funds for affordable housing, and then we've got to get really creative with what we do to make this work. And so our implementation funding that came out of that We were able to mobilize 2 years ago a $3 million, 10-year, zero-interest loan from UNC Chapel Hill to self-help to establish that acquisition fund. And then you'll see up here, there's a lot of matching grant funds and a ton of support from the town of Chapel Hill, which has helped make a lot of what I'm going to show you possible. But I want to kind of dive into like how it's actually working so far. So here's a few examples. Creative collaboration emerges. So this is a property on the upper left-hand corner, an abandoned house and a burnt-down house, 15 heirs. We were able to work with all those 15 heirs, convince them not to sell to an investor who was going to build 2 student rental homes. Habitat was able to work with the town of Chapel Hill to get creative and build 3 affordable homes, and all of those now have families that are historically connected to the neighborhood in them. And then we were able to work with self-help and empowerment to move the homes, one of the home that was on the lot, you see it there with the truck, and to create a new affordable rental property in partnership with Empowerment, one of our local CDCs. And so you see that both affordable rental and affordable homeownership for properties able to be created out of this one. A couple of other examples. We had to outbid 9 investors to buy one of the homes that had been with the same couple for 50 years but went up to auction. Folks said, this is a priority in our neighborhood and we want to save this in the neighborhood. So we outbid the investors. The next day, one of the investors called and said, I'll give you $10,000 more for that property. And we just laughed and said, you don't understand what this is about. We were able to work with that property with the Community Home Trust and 9 minority subcontractors. You can see the remodel of that. The Home Trust was then able to sell it affordably to a set of grandparents that were being outpriced on their Northside rental and were able to become first-time home buyers and keep their 8-year-old grandson, at Northside Elementary School. And then a final kind of creative example I was going to give you is we had a legacy seller. So we do have some folks who want to sell properties in Northside, but they've held on to their property so they don't become student rentals. So we worked with an heir who had not been able to keep up her property, but was interested in seeing something good happen with it. So she actually was willing to sell it at a discount, and we were able to create, it was only a 650 square foot home, and we were able to work with Pee Wee Homes, a new organization building tiny homes, to create an affordable tiniplex, so a duplex that will rent at $250 per unit. And then Habitat actually, thankfully, was already working in the neighborhood and agreed, because of all of the ongoing collaboration, that they would help oversee the building so that we could cut the cost of the building. And so this collaboration emerged between organizations that were willing to stretch their own models in order to figure out how we make this work on a neighborhood-based level. So then I just wanted to show quickly, I should mention that all of those also utilize Town of Chapel Hill funding to make those homes permanently affordable. That has been really critical, and matching funds that we've been able to mobilize from foundations. I'm not going to go through this right now, but I just wanted to show, if somebody has a question about the mechanism, that funds are rotated into properties, neighbors make decisions about those, so that community compass group is still active and actually makes choices about what happens with each of the houses in the land bank to make sure that it's a self-determination strategy. And then those homes are sold back, and then the cycle continues. And so we've already been able to do over 20 properties in the Northside Land Bank, and so I'll just show that in just a second. And so I just wanted to show that we now have families. These are new families who have moved into homes in Northside. We have families who have transitioned out of homelessness, families who are first-time home buyers, families who have returned to the community of their childhood. We have had this success, I believe, because of the great connective work happening at every level. This isn't about houses, it's about homes in a neighborhood where people live close, connected, and proud. Here's some more families that have moved into the neighborhood. So you can see Habitat Housing, Home Trust Housing, Empowerment Housing, all across the board, partners really working together to figure out how do we sustain a neighborhood that supports the legacy that has already existed in this neighborhood. And then I would be remiss if I also didn't mention that the key strategy, going back to retention, has been how do we also keep families in their homes? And so the Northside Neighborhood Initiative has actually created a whole separate grant funding for home repairs and accessibility repairs to keep families in their homes safely. We have also started a property tax mitigation fund to mitigate the increase of housing costs because of those investor-owned student rentals. And we've had ongoing festivals and community gatherings to really build the sense of connection between residents. And so these are just some of our folks who have been a part of our Promise of Home efforts. And so on the whole, you see the motto is live close, live connected, live proud. All of these dots on the map are all places that in 2 years the Northside Neighborhood Initiative has touched, either through a Promise of Home retention effort or all of the little houses there or all the new properties that have been affected that are now part of the Northside Land Bank. So that's 21 properties acquired by the Northside Land Bank, 28 affordable units created or in process with partners, 46 Promise of Home recipients in Northside and Pine Knolls, 12 families that now have been welcomed into Northside homes. And the first rise, this is the thing I'm most excited about, the first rise in the African American population since 1980. So we have actually seen something that has stemmed the tide of gentrification and has actually been benefiting folks across a range of incomes, from very affordable rental actually all the way up to market rate home ownership. And this has all been because of that creative collaboration. And so just a few other things to touch on the success of the effort. One of the things has been really placemaking, and so we have our first Northside Gateway marker that was inaugurated back in the spring in honor of the freedom fighters. We're hoping to have 2 more Northside Gateways that really honor specific parts of Northside's history. These, again, were strategies of the Northside Compass Group. The picture in the upper corner is just showing the extent of collaboration. We do welcome baskets for all the new neighbors, and the different partners join with us in welcoming new families to Northside. And then we also have new families who are participating now in leadership in the community, who have joined our Northside Compass Group and are participating actively in that. And then also in this bottom right corner, I wanted to show that one of the most exciting things is that we are very transparent with all sellers. We let them know what their fair market value is and that the land bank will always offer them that. But we've actually had people who have said, no, I want to sell my property for less because I want this to be guaranteed that it will be affordable for 99 years, because I want to see that legacy here, and nothing is affordable in Chapel Hill. So we've seen people choose to give up $40,000 of equity on their own homes. And so I hear that and I think, gosh, like if a family that is a janitor at UNC is willing to give up $40,000 on their own home to guarantee that this home will be preserved as affordable, we in Chapel Hill can do more as a whole. Like, we can sacrifice more. And that's what she said. She said as she did it, she said, legacy requires sacrifice. And we at Northside, we're willing to sacrifice, but is the rest of Chapel Hill, are we willing to sacrifice? And so I just thought that was a really powerful thing that, that has resonated with me ever since. So the last thing I just wanted to say is that there are some challenges and opportunities. It has been a really wonderful 2 years of seeing kind of the tide stemmed, but there's still some huge issues to be addressed. One is that a lot of the pressure has shifted to nearby neighborhoods. So we see in our neighboring Pine Knolls, we're trying to actually start a land bank there now and trying to expand the land bank efforts there, because Pine Knolls is one of the connected, historically African-American mid-wealth communities that is also struggling with some of the same pressures. Grant funding is necessary in most of these situations. We do have some matchmaking opportunities, but ongoing grant funding has to be mobilized to make it work. And a lot of that is also reliant on the town of Chapel Hill and Carbo in Orange County mobilizing their funds. And so it has been helpful to have those available. Enforcement is an ongoing challenge. The over-occupancy of student houses does create a rental housing bubble, and it's very hard to address that if we're not cutting back on the fact that a house that has 8 bedrooms and is able to rent 8 bedrooms can make $2,000 extra a month. That means that they can pay $200,000 extra at the front end. And so that's very hard to compete with in a market. And so having enforcement improve is a really critical piece. And then the most critical, which I think all of our affordable housing providers here could state, is that this has been really successful in a very specific place-based, neighborhood-focused way, but it's taken a lot of effort and resources, and the demand in Orange County is enormous. And so you've seen that we're having a lot of success in one neighborhood, but I think there's the stats recently from the Triangle J said that there's a need for 5,000 units for folks who make below $20,000 in our county. And so this has to be happening on so many different levels, and we need a lot more funding in order to make it happen. And then finally, I would just say that I'm sure that, let me find my last piece. So we have made some progress with the bond and penny efforts in Chapel Hill, but addressing this challenge will require more capital and more of us citizens of Chapel Hill and of these coalitions who do not simply want housing over there or funding that is neutral to its impact on us, but who welcome it on our streets and who yearn for the abundant gifts which those who live in affordable housing bring to a community, and who believe we can all do something to address this pressing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Hudson. That was terrific and very inspiring. I just wanted to make a quick mention of some of the partners that are working on this problem. Robert Dowling and the Community Home Trust, everyone knows Robert. We've got quite a number of people in town, Chapel Hill now working on this, folks at the county. Orange County has just hired a new housing director. Is she here by any chance? Also Dolores Bailey from Empowerment. And a lot of these folks have left literature on the back table. So if you're interested in finding out what they do, you can find out. Also, April Kemper is here, and she is very interested in starting an initiative on tiny houses. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up at the back. So now I'm going to introduce our last speaker, and then after that, Sheila Kreth will moderate Q&A. So Mai Nguyen is an associate professor and associate chair of the City and Regional Planning Department at UNC Chapel Hill. Her area of research is in housing policy and community development, and she's going to share with us her views of the problem, but also what other folks are doing to solve this problem.
Thanks, Julie. I have to admit that I know I changed the topic to challenges and opportunities, but when I started writing these speaking points, I kept on thinking back to the original question you asked me, which is, what's the relationship between affordable housing and economic development? So my remarks are probably going to be more geared towards that. You invited two speakers before me that are like the gold standard for housing and community development. So it's hard not to be inspired by what they do. But what strikes me about both of those presentations is how hard it is to actually provide affordable housing and preserve affordable housing for people who have lived in these communities. It takes a lot of partnerships. It takes a lot of determination. It takes a lot of capital, a lot of capacity in order to be committed for the long haul. So building and preserving affordable housing takes a real long-term commitment. And even though we had two really great examples today, the need for affordable housing is just so great. It is much more, there's many more families that need affordable housing than we are providing. So just to give you some statistics, when we talk about affordable housing, Nancy said it's paying 30% more of your income and utilities, your 30% more of your income on either a mortgage, rent, and utilities, right? So in Orange County, that's 23% of homeowners are cost burdened, and 46% of renters are cost burdened. They're paying a lot more for housing than they should be paying. A report from some of my colleagues over at the Center for Urban and Regional Studies shows that this trend of cost-burdened households is statewide, that households paying more than 50%, these are called severely cost-burdened households, have increased between 2008 and 2013 by 22.5%. And overcrowding has increased by 45.4% throughout the state of North Carolina. And this is not just a North Carolina trend. This is a national trend post-recession that we're seeing all over the country. So how does affordable housing relate to economic development? Well, when we talk about affordable housing and economic development, we have to be providing housing at all income levels. That's what Nancy mentioned, that it's not just about very low income housing, but moderate income housing and housing for wealthy families. We also have to provide both rental housing, and when we say rental housing, what we mean is multifamily housing. And that's not very popular in Chapel Hill. When people say, or developers propose multifamily housing, residents are not very happy about that. But to get the numbers where we need to be, we need more multifamily housing. And we need more for sale housing. There's just been a backlog of building and construction because of the recession, and we see this nationwide. Communities need to provide housing for their entire community, and we're talking about waiters as well as professors, police as well as doctors, because when families get priced out of communities, then the entire community suffers. I lived in Durham for 10 years before moving to Chapel Hill, so I've been very involved in housing and community development issues in Durham. And what I saw in Durham in the last 10 years that I lived there was an increasing number of families seeking affordable housing moving to Durham. And to give you some statistics, the median home value in Orange County is $314,000. The average home value in Durham is $200,000. That's 57% higher in Orange County than in Durham County. And so what happens when there's such a big disparity across these different counties that are very close together, that people will drive until they qualify. And they will drive to cheaper areas, cheaper neighborhoods, cheaper counties in order to qualify for a mortgage. And that's what was happening in Durham. I teach in the City and Regional Planning Department, and most of my students are master's students. And when they graduate, they often want to stay in the area, but where do they go when they live? They live in Durham because housing is unaffordable in Chapel Hill. But there's also something going on in Durham. Even if they could afford to live in Chapel Hill, many of them would want to live in Durham because there's a quality of life there. There's a nightlife there. There are young people, millennials, who want to live in Durham. And so Chapel Hill is not capturing all that growth. They're actually losing this brain drain, people moving, graduates of UNC, graduates of NC State moving to Durham instead of staying in Chapel Hill. And so what happens is that even though people work in Chapel Hill, like I did for 10 years, and live in Durham because housing's more affordable, then you have this leakage of sales tax. That the sales tax you could be capturing by people living and working in Chapel Hill is actually going to Durham because they go back home and they spend their money there. They go out to eat there. They go see movies there. And the sales tax revenue goes in the opposite direction. So there is this retail and economic leakage that having more affordable housing, having a diversity of housing in Chapel Hill can actually capture. So affordable housing and the supply of affordable housing is one aspect of affordable housing. The other is wages, that wages have to be higher in order for people to afford housing. So the federal minimum wage is $7.25, and a person working full-time can afford to pay $377 on rent a month. And a person who makes 30% of area median income in Orange County, that's a very low income family, can afford to pay $550 in rent if that's considered to be affordable, if they're paying 30% of their income. The average rents or the fair market rents, these are rents that HUD, actually the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, sets these fair market rents. The fair market rent for a studio apartment in Orange County is $710. The fair market rent for a two-bedroom is $978. So you can see that there is this wage gap, this wage and housing gap, right? In order to reasonably afford housing for a studio, you would have to get paid $13.65 an hour. For a two-bedroom apartment, the wages should be $18.81. So when you have working families not getting paid a living wage, they're not going to be able to afford housing, even if there is a supply of housing. So we have to address both. We have to address the supply of housing and the preservation of affordable housing, but also address the wages that we pay to workers. When I talked to the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, they're a state-level agency, and they administer a lot of programs and also fund local jurisdictions to supply housing. They talk about affordable housing as infrastructure, that we need to invest in affordable housing because it's part of a very important part of our infrastructure. So we invest in roads and sewer and water, but we don't often think about housing as infrastructure. And thinking about it that way makes it a critical part of our investment. So traditionally, we've receive federal funding in order to pay for low-income housing or subsidized housing, right, through our CDBG funds or our home funds. And with the decreasing amount of money that we were receiving from the federal government to actually pay for these programs, that local governments have to be much more innovative in what they do to supply and preserve affordable housing. When I worked with the city of Asheville, they really wanted to know whether or not they were using their funding, their CDBG, their home funds, and their home trust funds, if they were using them efficiently, meaning were they supplying as much affordable housing as other places that have the same types of funding. And so I compared Asheville to Chapel Hill, to Wilmington, North Carolina, and also Greenville, South Carolina. They tried to find, and also Durham. And what I found was that Asheville actually did use their affordable housing funds or their funds that they received efficiently, meaning that they built more affordable housing than any of these jurisdictions that I compared them to. And so they were doing a very good job, but they said, we want to do more. How do we do more? Even though, you did this comparison and we're building a lot of affordable housing. And I said, well, one thing you can look at is how much public land you own and how many public buildings you own in downtown, because it's very hard to build in Asheville. It's very expensive because it's hilly. And so the city realized that they actually owned a lot of properties downtown and they weren't using them to the highest and best use. And I said, well, okay, now that you've done this analysis, think about yourselves as a private developer. If you were a private developer, what would you do with property that you weren't using to its highest and best value? And they said, well, we'd probably sell it. We'd probably redevelop it into housing or something that would bring in more rents. And they ended up doing that. They created a program where they tried to incentivize developers to actually build more housing downtown and affordable housing downtown by actually moving some of their public facilities, public staff members outside of the downtown area because they realized they didn't need to be downtown. And so when they reoriented the way in which they thought about who they were, they didn't, not being a public agency just providing grants or administering federal funds, but really thinking about being a private sector developer, they ended up actually doing a lot more with the land and the properties that they had. And so there's a program, and I forget what the exact name of the program is, but Asheville has developed the program, and they actually have started getting developers interested in building affordable housing downtown. And then the last thing I'll say is when we do build affordable housing, that we have to build high quality, resilient, affordable housing. Oftentimes we build affordable housing in floodplains or in the least desirable areas of town, disconnected from resources and amenities or public transportation. And in the end, this will cost more when you compound social vulnerability with physical vulnerability in space. And how I know this is that I've been working with Eastern North Carolina to address long-term recovery from Hurricane Matthew, the communities that were the hardest hit. There are 6 communities that I've been working with, and what we found out was that a lot of the public housing, the subsidized housing, were in flood zones, were in floodplains. A lot of the low-income housing were located in floodplains. And so when they flooded, of course, these homes that were already in disrepair became severely damaged, and people were left out of a home and had to relocate. And these communities haven't recovered yet. They haven't even started rebuilding. Hurricane Matthew happened in October of 2016. So it's been a year, and none of these communities have really done a great job of rebuilding their affordable housing, their housing in general, because of the way in which social vulnerability and physical vulnerability were concentrated in these communities. And so when we think about building and we think about development, we need to think about the long term and how this is going to actually save us in the end if we build more energy efficient and resilient affordable housing that's located in good areas.
Thank you to all our speakers, and we're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions now and start a discussion. I wanted to briefly recognize a couple elected officials here. Pam Heminger, Mayor of Chapel Hill, is here. Jess Anderson from our council's here. Town Council. Barry Jacobs, Orange County Commissioner, is here. School Board Member Pat Hundrick is here. And we have a number of candidates. Yes, I'm going to get Ed. So I put him in the candidate category. So Michael Parker is here before we get to the candidates. Anyone else? Okay, and then I wanted to recognize Karen Stegman, I think I saw here. Yes. Alan Bwansey, Ed Harrison, who is also currently serving on the council, and Eugene Faurer, I think, is here also. All right, and we have Rachel Shavitz in the back row. And Carl, thank you, Carl Schuler is here. Those are both town council candidates, all of them. All right, so now we're going to turn to questions, and I'm going to invite all the speakers to come sit up at the table so that we can have a better dialogue. So please come on up. And Sheila Kreth will be our moderator for this portion.
All right, this is a time, I think, I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot in this very brief time that we've had. So this is now your time to ask a question. You can ask to a specific speaker or to any of them. Or you might want to make a comment or an observation or a view you have about affordable housing. I ask that when raising a question or making a comment, that you keep it very brief. We've already had our speakers for this evening, so please, 1 or 2 sentences so that we can have as many people as possible participate. When you can stand where you are, and I will repeat any question if you're not going to use the mic so that everyone can hear. Just give your name and then what your question is. There will be one mic, and Julie will have that for some people who would prefer to speak into the mic, and then there will be one hand mic that the speakers up at the table will share. Yeah. Ken, you had a question?
Yes. Everybody can hear me. I'm Ken Larson. The question I have is want to understand the correlation between UNC's enrollment numbers and pressure on affordable housing, meaning that, you know, if UNC just keeps growing and growing their enrollment, that's going to put more and more pressure on affordable housing as the students go off campus, more and more of them. So any comments on that?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I think the answer is probably yes. That I know that Linda Commissor sent some information earlier that I think UNC is housing about 54% of its students, which is, I think that UNC often shares is better than most of its other state university institutions, but still means that a lot of students are living off of campus. And I think that, you know, one of the things that we had advocated before is the biggest thing that I think would affect at least neighborhoods that are really close by is if sophomores had to live on campus, if that was ever a possibility, just because we have a lot of sophomores who now are moving into all of these by design student housing, and then the juniors are moving into housing all around, and so we're seeing that put a lot of pressure. But I don't know that addresses your question in the long term. I know Carborough is also experiencing more and more student rental pressures and is trying to figure out strategies to address those. I don't know if anybody else has a...
Another thing too is micro units would really help, because there was a study that we heard about at one point where students wanted, in order of preference, why they moved off campus, they wanted a place for their car, they wanted their own bathroom, and they wanted their own bedroom. So if you have a micro unit, you've got a place for your car, you don't need a lot of space. You don't need entertainment space because you aren't going to be there. And it's a way for the developer to get on a price per square foot basis the same rent as a larger space. It's not something that the town has to subsidize, but it is relatively affordable because you're renting less space.
Any others? All right.
I don't know what the enrollment numbers are for UNC, but I think that this gets to Nancy's point, is that we don't have enough of a diversity of housing here in Chapel Hill, that we need different types of housing stock, and the micro units, or just, you know, different types of multifamily housing, single-family housing, smaller housing. The stock that we have is pretty uniform across town, and so that places pressures on neighborhoods like North Side, because then speculators come in and they say, oh, but we can buy the single-family house, cut it up into 4, and then rent it out to students. So I think increasing the diversity of housing will help with some of those pressures.
All right. Yes, yes, sir.
Thank you, Julie. My name is David Keel, and this has been very educational for me because I don't know about this area. So this may be an ignorant question. But if as the graphics show, the development of these student stuff for housing is viewed as a problem in the north side and adjacent areas, why does town zoning permit that? And then secondly, if town zoning permits that, and there is all this speculative buying, and it's lucrative for the investors, is there an advantage to the town? In other words, the town get more property tax from those enhanced student housing? And if it does, then that creates maybe some more revenue that can then also be devoted to affordable housing. Or can the town use its leverage on zoning to negotiate with those investors to support more affordable housing or legacy housing in those areas?
I would say that, I mean, that's when I mentioned a lot of the defensive efforts that we went through in 2011, 2012. The town, we did do a whole rezoning, and that was actually after, and actually, I think Dolores is here too, and several neighbors who actually participated in 2003, 2004 in the creation of the first conservation district. So there have been a lot of efforts to do what the town, I'm sure there are more things that the town can do, and we're always exploring those. And it also has a 4-person, so the only way they can regulate who lives in the houses is how many unrelated people live in these houses, or what the impacts are on parking and other things like that, or the development size. Actually, the state has, one of the things that we did create was new design restrictions to have the houses at least be more in alignment with other houses, and the state has since taken away that ability for local municipalities. So we've had some challenges figuring out strategies to address the impacts like you're talking about. I don't think that it's a big advantage to the town to have student rentals. I don't in terms of property taxes, but I do know that we've been trying to explore more and more ways in which we can address the impacts. And I would say one of the things that I didn't mention because I didn't have time is that the Jackson Center has about 400 students who are now participating and as service partners in the work. And actually, we have a whole student pipeline effort, which is trying to recruit better students into some of the student housing to make who will participate more as active members of a community, and all kinds of ways of connecting students with nearby neighbors. So students in and of themselves are not problems. It's just once it gets to a certain level of student housing on a block, it becomes harder and harder to have students be aware that they live in a neighborhood. We have had students say, well, why are these old people moving into a student community? And this is a real problem. I mean, it's funny, but it's also not. I mean, right? This is one of Chapel Hill's most historic neighborhoods, and you have students who are saying that honestly, and they don't know. And so that's one of the reasons that this effort is also trying to make history tangible, saying, no, you're moving into a historic family neighborhood. Like this is, and so I think that that's why a lot of the efforts have been trying to educate students, the Good Neighbor Initiative and a lot of other things. But that is an ongoing challenge. But if other folks know of tools, I mean, this is something we've also been exploring a lot with the Institute of Government over time and city and regional planning to find more and more tools from other towns that have been trying other strategies. And again, I mentioned enforcement. I was really talking about occupancy, which is hard to enforce, but other places do, some other places do a more specific job of trying to address that. It depends on what the approach to enforcement is, but that's a difficult thing. So, yes.
And yeah, to underscore, enforcement is really difficult. When I was a probation officer and I knocked on somebody's door, they had to let me in so I could count the toothbrushes. The town does not have that option. And when somebody does report a suspected violation, the people who are suspected of violating it have the right to know who ratted them out, so to speak. And so it can get very, very difficult. That enforcement thing is a really tricky part.
Okay, another question. Yes. You stand and say, give your name, and if you'd like a mic, if not, I'll repeat the question.
So my name's April Kemper, and I wanted to go with what Nancy was saying about the micro units. So I'm really interested in tiny homes. And I actually have a tiny home builder here who lives right here in Chapel Hill, and a gentleman who's currently building his tiny home and would like to have a place to put it when he finishes. And so I wanted to ask about the fact how we can work with our current code, which now does not allow tiny houses as either a community or as a backyard accessory dwelling.
So the question is, how can Chapel Hill permit more tiny houses as accessory dwellings? Legally? Well, yes. Okay.
We're trying, and we are rewriting the. Do you want to answer? Actually,
We do allow them as accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, you do. But they have to be on a foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are on wheels.
So these are on wheels.
Oh.
The true tiny house that would, again, not impact the land, would not require infrastructure building to be put on a lot, hooked into sewer and power, and then, when the person left, they could take it with them. Very affordable,
Little impact on the community in some degree too, because we promote composting toilets and that sort of thing. So it leaves less of a carbon footprint, so that sort of thing. Solar electricity,
affordability for sure.
yes, affordability.
Some counties and states, require that if they're to be legal, they want them blocked up, sort of like a mobile home,
Wheels off.
and the wheels taken off, so they just can't be like what we used to call the midnight special years ago, that things are here today and gone tomorrow. And I can understand that, and tied down. And a lot of people, end up building like a permanent deck to it. So
Other
they are
communities
permanent.
allow that because they are built with permanent on it.
Let's go back to, no, I don't know if that answered your question, which is. Sure. Panel, comments?
I would like to see us get more creative with what the types of housing that we allow, and we are rewriting the LUMO, and that's a possibility that we could take a look at that and see how we can write that in without somebody being able to take advantage of it, and that's the tricky part when you're writing the LUMO.
And one of the things I talked about, but it's not the technically the same kind of tiny home you're talking about, but Pee Wee Homes is an organization that's been working to try to figure out how to create kind of CO'd, really small homes that are affordable to families. And one of the challenges that we ran into when we were also looking at other models was the challenges of state building code and how local municipalities navigate that, because I think that the state building code requires, unless it's a mobile home, and it has the federal requirements for a mobile home, then there's some specific requirements that the state building, which y'all would know way better than me. But I know that when we were looking into that, we ran into some challenges trying to figure out, unless you did it off the grid, how you can get it on the grid, knowing that it is an important tool. So I definitely think it's something worth exploring if it's done well. And I don't know that we found any, that's why we ended up just creating things that are actually connected to water and sewer and other things like
Just
that.
as a follow-up to what you said, I'm Kimberly Brewer, and I also very much support tiny houses. The International Residential Code was amended in December of last year to address tiny homes, to address some of the very issues that you're talking about. And so the state, if the state adopts that new appendix in the residential code, then we will have made a major step forward, because then we would be adopting that ourselves. It didn't address the chassis part in terms of having a mobile tiny home, a tiny house on wheels, but it was a great step forward.
Can you help us understand the difference between then a mobile home and a tiny home or a peewee home? Because it gets very confusing when you're hearing all these regulations and things. And as we know, mobile homes are not very energy efficient, so they become a huge cost burden for people who pay the land rent, the mobile home rent, or if they own it. Their utility bills, as we've learned at Habitat, are outrageous on these mobile homes. So are the peewee homes built better, differently? What's the difference? Help us, educate us.
Well, my name is Jeff. Sorry, bad knees. My name's Jeff, and we're with Free Spirit Tiny Homes here in Chapel Hill. We've been here 2 years. We've lived here 35 years, so we're well aware of all the community goings on. There's different classifications for everything in the code book. And the code book right now states what a mobile home is, and what a park model is, and what a travel trailer is. But there's nothing in the code books right now for tiny homes. And if you've all been watching anything on tiny homes across the nation, on HGTV or any other show, they're kind of sweeping the nation. And you spoke of Asheville, and they're all over in Asheville. There's actual subdivisions of tiny homes in
You
Asheville.
really have to keep that mic up to your mouth. Sorry.
And so but we build them just like a regular home to building code specs, 16-inch center, studs, hurricane brackets. We follow the code book. We don't skimp on the code book. We'd love the inspectors to come out and look at our house. They won't because they have no jurisdiction over them. So we're hoping in 2018, if they adopt these codes, they will start getting inspected. And if they start getting inspected, maybe they'll be more accepted in our county and other counties.
Real differences in layman terms between a mobile home and a tiny home?
Well, the construction.
So it's the construction, that you actually constructed differently.
I think it's better constructed.
And a tiny house looks just like a house. It can look like any house. It can be very modern, it can be cottagey, you know.
Okay, okay. And yeah, it's what's this?
So
What's
they're up to 400 square feet legally, anywhere from 400 or under, and they have to be 8.5 feet wide and no higher than 13.6 to actually be.
And can you send us this information, email some that?
We sign up sheet, Pam, out.
That'd be great. I picked up the flyer, but sending an email gives me the ability to pass it on a little better. Thank you.
Pam, obviously you don't watch enough HGTV. Yes. Dolores.
Hi, Dolores Bailey, Executive Director of Empowerment Incorporated, and we handle a lot of affordable rentals right now. Tim, you mentioned the cap on the rent for Glen Lennox, which I think is really interesting. My question is actually about, do you all, Nancy, think that there might be an opportunity that we start capping or coming up with some type of coding that protects renters? Because part of what our families are experiencing is that once the rents go up for students, then they're also required to pay that kind of rent. And so what we need is some type of law enforcement to try to cap what's going on with our rentals. Do you think that might happen anytime soon?
I would certainly hope so anytime soon. I don't know. Town government moves slowly, but I certainly was taking notes about what Tim was saying. Do you
I agree. I understand. But it has to start somewhere here. So I'm wondering if we could initiate something as a town that might make a move.
Well, wait, does somebody have an answer to the legal aspect of what can be done?
I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think it's legal to cap rents.
Well, we have a little different program. So there's, you can get into the virtues.
You can't force private developers to do it, but they can choose to do it voluntarily.
Or a part of so there's a 15%, the inclusionary zoning ordinance, for example, it caps the limit. So capping all rents everywhere, New York has a bit of this, and you can get into the pitfalls and the benefits that's resulted in. San Francisco think of it as a magnified version of Chapel Hill. Much of San Francisco, but then in terms of size, much of San Francisco still thinks of itself as a small town, and it's beautiful, and they don't want to go up because it changes the visual. And I grew up in the Chicago suburbs in the cornfield, and I understand there's this, it's a struggle. Some of the ways to add this stock, variety of stock, is to go up in certain places. You want to keep certain things. There's part of that, and that can help keep the housing down. But a total cap would probably blow up in your face, and every developer, including Grub, would come and say, whoa. But we absolutely do it for a chunk. So we have like a 15% max property-wide. So we can have that impact without bankrupting us. And if you're a finance person and you saw some of our early stage pro formas, you would run away as fast as you can. We're just eating up a lot of money right now, but we're finding ways to balance it. So as a tool, like, we have this vested renter thing that applies to maximum 15% of Glen Lennox. That has a good impact. But again, like, Glen Lennox can't do it all. We're not trying even. But there's an interesting tool. Maybe that would work in other situations. So all these little drops will add up to a big bucket. And I wish I had the answers. If this brain power community can't solve it in one sitting, we know it's tough. But it's always encouraging to see all these possibilities.
We're really out of time unless someone has a burning, passionate question that's different from what's been raised. Yes, I think you had your hand up.
Dave Cedar, our UNC speaker, mentioned Asheville as being more efficient with regard to affordable housing. What have we learned from that can be applicable to Chapel Hill? Which sort of raises another question of college towns all over the state, maybe the country, have a similar problem. Where are the best practices that could be applied to us?
Fred is telling us we're out of time. If there is a brief answer on the, issue of Asheville and what they're doing and what can be done,
I guess I'd say that we're a little tied by our state legislature. We are a state that has home rule, which is different, or Dillon's rule. Yes, that's true. But they have taken some risks, and it's a matter, so I'll give you an example of the town of Davidson, who also has an inclusionary zoning ordinance. They've been sued 2 times, and they lost the last time because a developer sued them because the state says that inclusionary zoning cannot be mandatory. It has to be voluntary. So there are ways in which cities can try to be innovative, but there are also restrictions based on our state governance and the way in which the laws work in North Carolina. What Asheville has done is that they have a nonprofit housing developer that's actually been very good at leveraging the funding that they receive from the town, the city, in order to build affordable housing. And also, as I mentioned, Asheville's been very progressive and have been very active and committed to affordable housing. So they put a lot of energy into it. They get a lot of people involved, lots of nonprofits, they have lots of community discussions about it. And so I think it just takes a commitment and just a lot of effort and multi-pronged efforts, public-private partnerships in order to build affordable housing and to leverage the resources across these different sectors.
All right, what I'd like to do now before everybody decides they're ready to go home for, I don't know, whatever you do when you go home at this hour, watch HGTV. What we'd like to do is for you, having hopefully been kind of energized by these ideas, is we want to get your ideas of what you think any of us should do in our neighborhoods, the town should do, the nonprofits that are working on the housing issue. And we would like to get your ideas. We're going to capture it, and we will use that to pass forward. We'll put it up on the CHALT website, and we will share it with other agencies and the town council. Your ideas about what needs to be addressed, what should be done, whether it's by you or by someone else. So be happy to start, Del. No, we're taking notes now, not questions. What your ideas are.
I'd also comment on it as well, if possible. I had read about a habitat project in Charlottesville called Southwood, which bought a trailer park and created a mixed income community so that the market rate housing helps support the rest of the community. I mean, they haven't done it yet, but that's the plan. So I was curious whether we thought there was some place in the town. Turn it on. Turn it on.
Push the button until it turns green.
Can you hear me now? No.
Push the button until it turns green.
Okay, so what are you
Got it,
suggesting,
got it.
Dell? Because we need to move on in terms of time.
I'm suggesting perhaps at the Green Tract, we could build a mixed income community for where different levels of housing could support each other.
Okay, all right. We're going to wait on any responses. Other suggestions that you have for your community, your neighborhood, for the town? Yes, in the back. Please just stand up and.
In the town of Chapel Hill, I talk loud, but I'll talk louder. In the town of Chapel Hill, we are clearly here, and we have Nancy and other representatives, but our town isn't that big. I'd really like Carborough and Chapel Hill and the jurisdictions to work actively together. I think the commitment is here. I'm not sure what the barriers to success to move things forward are, but even though we're two municipalities and more within the county, we're all within the county and neighboring. So that's what I would like.
Hi, my name is Beth. I'm wondering if there could be community investment or a town directive to address building the built infrastructure in a way that is sustainable using solar or green roofs. For example, Green Grid has a system that, even though it's not very pretty, it's very serviceable, where you can put a 2x2 planter, really, that goes on top of a previous built building and can help the water stay before it goes down into the streams quickly for a while. And if we had some initiative for the town to be able to, I don't know, sponsor some of these or have different community people to buy them so that different people can put them up on
Could you
whatever
kind of
built.
summarize, though? You're talking about affordable housing with environmental.
Yes, anything that will help the environment to help
Okay.
our responsibility to future generations.
Okay. Other suggestions? Yes, ma'am.
There are lots of good ordinances that other communities have adopted to allow tiny house communities and tiny house on wheels as backyard units. We should evaluate those ordinances and change our ordinances to allow them. It's being done.
All right. Others? Yes.
Along with the overall affordable housing, I'm sure other people are aware of the senior housing challenges, keeping things affordable for people with their fixed incomes. So along with the mixed housing, I like the sort of co-housing ideas to help people age in place.
Okay. Co-housing. Anyone else? We're coming.
My name is Eugene Farrar, longtime, lifetime citizen for Town Chapel Hill, and also a candidate for mayor. My suggestion is that now that we've had this big discussion, that we start working on affordable housing right now, because if we don't, Chapel Hill is going to be built out. The other thing too, I would love to see multi-family dwellings go up as well, because if we're going to say that we want a place to call home, then we need it to be a place called home for everybody.
Thank you. Others? Yes. David?
Before I ask an ignorant question, this may be an ignorant suggestion, and that is, in the presentations, I heard different problems under the general area of affordable housing. I heard recent graduates can't find housing. Families in legacy, in older neighborhoods are being forced out.
Okay, but what's your suggestion?
So, and the third group is like the people who work for the city and various make the low. So my suggestion is to identify the specific populations these particular affordable housing policies are trying to serve, set some targets for those populations, and then create strategies that are targeted to those populations. And there might be some difference, and maybe this has already been done.
Okay, thank you. Was there another? Yes.
Hi. So I know that requiring sophomores to live in on campus will probably not be a very popular opinion, but I do like the idea of making students more aware of the impact that they're having on the community when they leave campus. And so maybe expanding that kind of idea to communities outside of Northside, or working more with the university to make students more aware of the impact that they're having when they leave campus, and making the university kind of have more of a stake in that, I guess, trying to make a way for them to encourage more students to stay on campus.
Okay.
Yes, I'm a student.
Pam has a suggestion.
That we've been trying to figure out how to do a strategic plan and we gathered last year what we have. And Wednesday night, we're going to start the discussion strategic plan for where we need to go. But our council needs to set a goal. We need goals for how many units, what does that look like? We're about 5% affordable in this community. That doesn't feel good. There's multiple, that's all involved between rentals and home ownership. We want to do more and trying to figure out with our limited land space what that looks like. And so I love creative ideas like tiny houses and options. We did the accessory dwelling units, but we have more work to do in that category too. So we're looking at all that, and all the while, UNC is adding 275 students every year. They've been mandated to grow. Those students come in mostly as freshmen, but then they come out, like he said, sophomores and juniors. So I've been very determined not to create any more student housing on downtown parcels so that we can keep better opportunities for commercial and families to live downtown. Because it kills the rent when you have 4 students paying in a small home, $700-800 a piece. It's changing. UNC actually took off 800 units last year of their campus housing because of the lack of students living there. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that. And we've been actually having conversations with the university, who's one of the biggest players here, about creating more affordable housing, getting them involved in this, and creating more housing for the graduate students. We have a lot of graduate students who come here who want to live on campus. Because they're only here for a few years and they don't want to have to live really far away. So I think talking with our partners of UNC and UNC Healthcare and getting some real commitments out of them, as they are the biggest employers here.
Well, I'm going to step out of my role for a moment and say that since I spent my career in universities, there are universities in this country who own a lot of property and they build housing, rental and home ownership below the market value for faculty and staff. And the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill owns a lot of property. And I would love to see encouragement for them to begin to take responsibility, not just for their students, but for these people who can't afford to live here, who work for them. All right, I'm going to say that we will stop now because we're at the end, but anyone who wants to stay, and if the presenters are willing to stay and talk with folks, you're welcome to stay. We have to be out of the room about 9, but that leaves us a little bit of time.
Final comments from our panelists?
Well, I just had a final one for your kind of mixed income. Glenn Lennox is the solution to all of your problems. Not really, just kidding. But because we have that luxury of 70 acres and a development agreement, we could focus more. And again, not every doesn't work for every development and every parcel, but in the development agreement, it is specifically envisioned to be a mixed income community. The old post-World War II charming, you don't want to live in them, but you want to tell people to live in them. They're like, oh, they're old and they're terrible sometimes, but we're fixing them up and there's ways to improve those. But then we're going to have new apartments and then condos and then maybe senior living, single family and townhomes for sale. So that is intended to do that. But as you saw, that took 7 years to figure out how to align those goals. It was an early process. It can be sped up now, I'm sure. But there are ways to do that within these communities. And while not every community can do that, it's nice to say maybe one's a piece here, one's a piece here, and they're close together, because it's hard to pull off 70 acres in Chapel Hill anymore. But there are, I think the town has been really helpful in this.
Well, if you can add tiny homes, then you've got everybody, you know? Um, I'll just say that now that I remember what Asheville did is that places, cities in North Carolina have started to create a steady stream of funding for affordable housing. So I know that Orange County passed a $5 million bond measure, and that's important, but it's not going to be a steady stream of funding that's dedicated towards that. So Durham passed a penny for housing. Asheville also has a housing trust fund that they fund every year. And what that does is it allows developers, affordable housing developers, to plan for the future. And it allows the town, the city, to leverage nonprofit sector resources in order to build more affordable housing. So having that steady stream and being able to depend on it is really important for planning.
Property tax. We have increased.
How much is it?
It's a penny for housing. And the bond issue next year if you want it. 800,000 a year. Right?
Well, now then you have to think about how you're leveraging other resources with those funds. Yeah, what you do with it.
Hudson, did you want to?
I was just going to say really quickly that one of the things I think we've learned a lot in Northside is, especially in the context of Chapel Hill, we're a town that people love to plan. It's so intellectual that we all love to like get it right and we want to be perfect. And I think that one of the things that was really useful about our Compass Group game planning effort is that people were in action as they planned. So they were putting things into strategy and action and then learning and then reflecting and figuring out how do we make this better. And I think that we have been starting to do that more and more in Chapel Hill, but I think that that's really essential that we don't try to get everything right and have the whole affordable housing plan before we actually have more funding and have more things happening all across the board, because the gap is just going to keep growing wider, and then it's going to be harder and harder to find a plan that works for that gap. And so I just think that having more, I mean, one of the things we found is that having capital was huge in leveraging creative partnerships. And so having local capital to bear and to continue to grow that has been really helpful, and I think it will be to getting more and more creative planning and strategic planning as a part of that. So I was just going to add that. And then that I think that the CEF Advocacy Choir, like having folks not only advocating who are experiencing homelessness or a range of housing needs, but also having those folks help determine what that housing should look like and how it should be, because I think that we've also seen that the designs and the quality are getting a lot better when we actually are relying on the people who know best what they need. So just having that be a part of those conversations.
Would you all join me in thanking all of the presenters?